Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. So I'm very pleased to open this plenary session. I have to begin with an announcement. Ganesh Garam, who was supposed to be speaking on this panel, is still in Nepal. There was a constitutional collapse, and he was really needed in his country, and so he sends his regrets. He very much wanted to be here. But we are served well. The other two panel members are going to do a fabulous job. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce two really inspiring women doing amazing work. They are fierce advocates to those without voices and without resources. So I'm going to begin with Peggy Healy. Has been a human rights advocate for nearly 30 years. She's currently Senior Vice President, Latin America at Covenant House. She formerly directed Fordham's Crowley Program in International Human Rights. She's carried out her human rights work in many different ways and places over the years, beginning in Nicaragua in the 1970s when she was a Mary Knowles sister working as a nurse in poor communities. And Peggy has kind of had many iterations of service, like from nurse to lawyer to legal advocate to now overseeing a major organization that delivers direct services. We are really thrilled to have her here. She regularly testified on Capitol Hill. Her accomplishments are just too numerous to list, but we're thrilled to have her. Anne Milgram served as is currently a senior fellow at the NYU School of Law. She served as a federal prosecutor in the criminal justice section of the United States Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, prosecuting complex international sex trafficking, forced labor, and domestic servitude human trafficking cases. She also prosecuted hate crimes and official misconduct cases nationwide. In 2004, she was promoted to become the lead federal prosecutor in the country for human trafficking crimes. Milgram was awarded the U.S. Department of Justice Special Commendation for Outstanding Service in December 2004, and the U.S. Department of Justice's Director's Award in September 2006. She also served as New Jersey's Attorney General from 2007 to 2010, where she headed the 9,000-person Department of Law and Public Safety. Again, a person who has kind of served and continues to serve in many, many different domains. This is even a little slice of what they do. So I am, without further ado, give you Peggy. You first?
Anne.
I gave you Anne.
Thank you so much. Peggy and I did this about a year ago at the National Press Club in Washington. And so when we were talking about preparing yesterday, Peggy said, well, let's do what we did then. And then I thought, well, what exactly did we cover? So what I want to do today, not knowing the different levels of expertise that you all have in this area, I'm going to start with some basics. And I'll sort of, I think, set the tone for what human trafficking is, both in the United States and internationally. I'll tell you a little bit about some of the work that I've personally done, some of the cases I've handled, and then I think Peggy will be able to really add a lot of complexity to that by talking about specific instances of trafficking in Latin America and other work that she's done on trafficking. And then what we're going to try to do is stop early enough that we can have a lot of time for question and answer, because we usually find that that's the most sort of fruitful part of these meetings. So trafficking in persons is defined a lot of different ways. The way that you hear it defined most in today's news media is modern-day slavery. That phrase only begins, I think, to capture the worldwide tragedy that is human trafficking. It is unfolding every single day, and it is unfolding very, very frequently in front of our own eyes. There are estimates, and I'm going to give you a lot of them, but I'm going to start by telling you that I don't believe them, right? So the estimates vary widely across the world. I'm going to tell you what the estimates are and who gives them, but I'm going to tell you, I think, very sincerely that no one knows for sure what the exact numbers are. And people are guessing based on the number of calls that go to hotlines, on the number of victims that get served, on the number of cases that gets brought. In many instances, I'm sure they're grossly underreported, and that the numbers are too low. And in other cases, I think maybe they're just jumps and statistical leaps that people make. So the statistic that's given in terms of what the cost is, how much money is made worldwide every single year based on trafficking, that number varies from $20 billion to $32 billion. The $32 billion number comes from a recent BBC report. I've heard everywhere from 20 to 32 billion. No matter how you slice those estimates, the low end or the high end, it's a massive amount of money. What human trafficking is about, in my personal definition, and I'll tell you a little bit about what the US definition and what the international definition is, my personal definition is that a person has been compelled to provide labor or services. And that is including prostitution, it's including domestic servitude, it's including someone selling trinkets on the street. It is very, very broad, the definition that I would give you in terms of labor and services. Now, what you think about when you think about things that are contraband across the world, the number one source of contraband across the world, can anybody guess what it is? You guys are all very smart, smarter than Peggy and I are on some of this stuff. Wait. Drugs, right? Across the world, the number one source of contraband is drugs. That number is outrageously high. The number two source for years was, any guesses? Guns. That was being transported, contraband, illegal contraband that's being transported across the world. That number, there's a question now of whether it's still number two or whether the thing that was number three, which is people, human trafficking victims, is number three or should be number two. In Mexico, the government has flipped 2 and 3, the Mexican government, and now would argue that the number one source of contraband in Mexico is drugs, illegal contraband, number 2 is people. And when you think about it, there's a huge difference between drugs and illegal guns and people. And that difference, there are 2 huge differences. One is that if you're caught with drugs or an illegal weapon on you, you're immediately guilty of a crime, right? So if you think about if you've got a kilo of cocaine, somebody catches you with a kilo of cocaine, you're going to be arrested and probably charged. What happens if you see 3 people walking across the street, right? What if you see a man and 2 women standing on a street corner at 59th and 10th? Those women may be human trafficking victims, but there's nothing inherent in that that makes it what we would see as illegal contraband. What you see are people who are just walking down a street or they're standing on a street corner, so it's a lot harder to detect. And that's one thing that people who are engaged in trafficking like, right? It's much harder for law enforcement to figure out who's being trafficked and who isn't. The second thing is that what happens to that kilo of cocaine? It gets sold, it gets made into whether it's crack or somebody injects it, and what is the ultimate result is that that commodity is used, right? That kilo of cocaine is sold, somebody buys it, and it's used, it's gone. What about a person? A person can be sold time and time again. A person can be trafficked. We had a domestic servitude case when I was at the Department of Justice with a woman in Wisconsin who had been held for 19 years. 19 years, right? We had trafficking cases. We had, I did the first major international sex trafficking case when I was at the department. We had over 50 victims in Mexico and about 7 victims who were charged victims in the US who had instance after instance over the course of years and years of forced prostitution. So again, when you start thinking about what we see as the worst illegal contraband in the world, you have to think about human trafficking. You have to think a little bit about, I think, how that's different. The worldwide estimate on the number of trafficking victims also varies greatly. So the number that the State Department and the Department of Justice have used for years is 700,000 or 800,000 people who are trafficked into the US each year. Now keep in mind that doesn't take into account the number of victims who are American-born or who are already residing in the US, right? But that number was their estimate of how many people were being trafficked into the US or being brought into the US for the purposes of human trafficking. The number that the UN released recently, the ILO, the International Labor Organization released, is 18.7 million people worldwide, right? And so, I'm sorry, the 800,000 number, I'm sorry, I apologize. The 800,000 number is worldwide US estimates. The 18.7 million is the UN's estimate from this year. The number that we think is trafficked into the US is probably closer to 14 or 15,000. But this question of how many people worldwide live in human trafficking is simply unanswerable right now. And so when you think about 800,000, which I would argue is at the low end, to 18.7 million, which is probably closer in my estimation to what the number is, but again, no one is sure. So this is a problem that needs to be better defined and better understood. What happens as well, and I want to talk a little bit about international stuff because that's the point of your conference, but I do want to bring it back as much as I can to what's happening in the US. But internationally, many foreign countries are what we call source destination, and transit countries. And what that means is that, take for example, Thailand. In Thailand, there are Thai women who are forced into prostitution. There are Thai kids, boys and girls, who are forced into different types of labor, be it domestic servitude, selling trinkets. You can think about all the different types of options, type of ways in which people can be, compelled into forced labor. So there are kids there, and there are adults there who are what we would call, it's a destination. It's where human trafficking actually happens. It's also a source country. Thailand is the #1 source in terms of victims coming to the United States, victims who come forward as victims of trafficking. Thailand is the #1 country in the year 2010. So they both are a destination, and they're a source of human trafficking. And finally, they're also a transit country. Because of the way that Southeast Asia is geographically located, there are victims from Cambodia that come through Thailand, and so on. And so that's an example of a country that is all three. Some countries are one, some countries are destination countries. The US is typically considered to be a destination country, although, as we'll talk about in a little bit, it's a destination country, but it's also a source country. There are a number of domestic trafficking victims. So I think that's important to think about. Internationally, I told you that Thailand is the #1 country that had victims in the US. And the way the fact I've used for this is that these are victim certification letters that are done by the Department of Justice. So these are actual court and justice identified victims. And when you look at the list of the 10 top countries for the year 2010, #1 is Thailand, 2 is India, 3 is Mexico, and this is for adults who are human trafficking victims. 3 is Mexico, 4 is the Philippines, 5 is Haiti, 6 is Honduras, 7 is El Salvador, 8 is the Dominican Republic, which of course is right next to Haiti. 9 is Guatemala, and 10 is Peru. When you start to think about children who are victims of human trafficking who've been brought to the US from other countries, that list is a little bit different. #1 is Mexico, #2 is Honduras, #3 is Guatemala, #4 is El Salvador, and #5 is China. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of what's happening in the US. Now, there are 2 definitions that are used across the world for human trafficking. They both, surprisingly, come from the year 2000, right? And I say surprisingly because it's hard to believe, we read so much about human trafficking today, it's hard to believe that it was really defined basically 11 and a half years ago. In the United States, you know the story, and I don't need to tell anyone the story, but the story starts with slavery, with antebellum slavery and the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude. In 1948, Congress passed a law prohibiting involuntary servitude. That law was enforced, and it was used by the Department of Justice as the federal law that applied to human trafficking up until the late 80s, early 90s. At that point, the US Supreme Court issued a decision that said that involuntary servitude had to be basically had to be force or the threat of force, legal process or the threat of legal process, and I'll explain to you what that means in a second, or actual physical restraint or the threat of physical restraint. Now, so think about that. You have force, you have restraint, and you have legal process. Force, everyone understands. Restraint, you can think about a lot of examples. I just told you the story of the woman who was kept in a house in Wisconsin for 19 years and really not allowed to come and go. Her liberty was incredibly restrained. Legal process is when you threaten the police are going to arrest you, right? It can be a legitimate or threat in some ways, right? It sort of sounds strange, but if a police officer finds someone on the street who's committed a crime, a police officer can say, I'm going to arrest you. If you are here illegally and the immigration authorities say to you, we're going to take you in, you're not lawfully here, they can say that. So there are laws that are enforced by the police and by immigration, but those are the only people who can enforce those laws. So if a human trafficker says to a victim, if you go outside, the police are going to arrest you, that's what's known as an abuse of the legal process, because that trafficker doesn't have the right to arrest someone. If someone says immigration is going to get you because you're here unlawfully, again, the same thing. So that's what legal process means. It does happen in some cases. It's not the prevalent type of trafficking that we see. But that's what the law was in the US. And the problem with that, and the problem in the case that went to the Supreme Court, was based on 2 farmhands and a farmer named Ike Kosminski. And what happened in that case is that there were an incredible number, as there are across the world with human trafficking, instances of subtle forms of coercion. Short of force, short of actual physical restraint and short of threats of the legal process. But situations that people were put in where they felt compelled to provide labor. And you can think about that as a threat against someone in your home country. You can think about that as, if you don't do this, I'm going to hurt your family back home. You can think about it in such, it's very, very broad and includes forms of psychological coercion. It also takes into account that a victim doesn't need to be personally struck or personally restrained to actually fear that they're going to be hurt, right? And to be compelled to provide labor or services. And so what Congress did in the year 2000 was pass new laws, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, right? And that's the standard for the US now, which sets out what sex trafficking and labor trafficking are, and basically says, we understand that human trafficking is often really subtle, right? The first case that was tried under that statute was my case in New Hampshire. And it was 3 Jamaican men. They were tree cutters, and they were basically brought from Jamaica to New Hampshire for a tree cutting service. The case is United States versus Bradley. These guys were basically brought, they were promised a certain amount of money per hour, $12, I don't remember the exact numbers, $12, $13. They were promised a place to live. They were promised that they would get some time off on weekends, and they were promised that they'd basically have a great life and that they could go back home. So what happens? The first 2 guys come, they come and they end up having trouble. One of the first 2 workers escapes. The first minute that the guy has escaped, the woman in the couple, the defendants were a couple in Litchfield, New Hampshire, the woman threatens the guy who's remaining and says, I'm going to go get a gun and I'm going to kill that guy, right? In Jamaica, that's a very real threat. And she knows that they've gone back to Jamaica. And the other victim who's there feels that if he doesn't continue to work, he's going to be hurt himself or somebody else is going to be hurt. At the same time, so he finishes his term of service, he goes back home. 2 other Jamaican men come up. And the reason that the couple was recruiting Jamaican men is that, candidly, they couldn't keep U.S. workers. All the U.S. workers were quitting because of the way that they were being treated by the couple. So there's no question that the couple didn't treat any of their employees well. But in this situation, the 2 men come from Jamaica, and the minute they get off the plane, their documents are taken. Their passport is taken, which has their legal U.S. visa, which everyone who's here needs to have, and their plane ticket back is taken. So immediately, there's some restraint in their movement. They're brought to the house. They're not given a room in the house. They're basically given a dog shed in the back of the house. So their living conditions are absolutely horrific. It's close to the middle of winter in New Hampshire. There's no heat, there's no running water, and they live in very difficult circumstances. They go to work and they're paid, but they're not paid what they were promised. So they're paid about $8 or $9 an hour. They're not paid $12 an hour. And the other thing that happens in this case is that they go out sometimes, right? They go to the nightclub down the street, and they're allowed to walk and come and go to the nightclub. They're allowed, they have a birthday party that celebrates their birthday. They're not allowed to leave the town, but they're allowed to come and go in the town. They're given bicycles. And so they also know, however, that this threat has been made against this guy who's escaped, this prior worker. And that's the threat that is the linchpin of that case. At the end, when police come and there's a kind neighbor who reports something weird is happening in that house, something doesn't feel right, the man in the couple actually sicks the dog of their house on the Jamaican workers, and the wife starts to hit one of the men. But again, what you find in a case like this is very subtle forms of coercion. You find documents taken, you find that their movement was somewhat restricted, but they are paid, and the threats are not against them until the end when there's violence against them. So I tell you that just as an example of how subtle human trafficking can be, and that there are a lot of indicia that you would not necessarily think of as related to human trafficking. So the definition in the US basically allows for subtle forms of coercion. It allows, in the case of forced labor, for a scheme, a pattern, or a plan that makes someone fear serious harm. It allows in the case of, and then there's the case of sex trafficking, which is basically force, fraud, or coercion is used to compel a woman to engage in prostitution, right? Force, fraud, or coercion. Fraud can be very broad. I did a case where men had promised women that they loved them and wanted to marry them. They got married in many instances. They had babies together in many instances. And then the men compelled the women into prostitution. But they were fraudulently brought to the US under the auspices of getting legitimate work. There are other instances. Coercion, again, can be threats against family members. It can be very, very subtle. The other important thing to know about sex trafficking in the US is that anyone under the age of 18 is a per se victim of human trafficking, if there is a trafficker. So think about all the situations that you read about in the paper where there's a woman who's arrested, a young girl who's arrested at the age of 15 or 16, who's engaged in prostitution and she is a pimp. Under the federal definition, the woman is a victim of trafficking and the man is a human trafficker, right? So I think that's important to understand from the US perspective. Very quickly on the international perspective, and I should tell you that the breakouts in the US are about 70% sex trafficking and 30% labor, and labor including factories, farms, domestic servitude, people who work in houses. The international definition is a little bit complicated because it's based on Palermo, which is the international UN document that came out in the year 2000 as well. What Palermo basically prohibits is exploitation. It doesn't exactly define exploitation though, and that's been of course a cause of a lot of concern in different countries that have tried to adopt it. And so basically what it says, it also has different means: force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception. It talks about recruitment or transportation of persons, but then it says exploitation. And there's no definition of exploitation beyond prostitution, forced labor and services, slavery, and organ trafficking. It's a very broad definition intended to apply to every country in the world. It's difficult because a lot of countries have tried to take that and make that into their specific laws, which we can talk about later if you want. And they also have a separate provision for children that all children can, per se, that are engaged in forced labor or prostitution, be victims of trafficking. What I think, I'll tell you 3 other things, and then I'm going to turn it over to Peggy to give you some more specific examples of victim work. The first is what trafficking isn't. It's not smuggling, and it's not movement across borders. And I can't tell you how many international countries I've sat in on behalf of the State Department where people describe trafficking to me as somebody who's been smuggled across a country line. It doesn't matter. You could have somebody that's in the state of New York that never crosses the line of the state of New York, that basically never goes to New Jersey or Connecticut or California. That's a trafficking victim. You can have somebody in El Salvador, never leaves the country of El Salvador, that person could be a trafficking victim. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about this worldwide, and I think it's a really important question because crossing borders or crossing state lines has nothing to do with human trafficking. Human trafficking is compelled labor or services, and that can happen anywhere, whether or not you cross lines. The other thing is I think it's important to think about what the indicators are of human trafficking. And I'm going to run through these for you, not necessarily in your professional capacity, but in your personal capacity, right? People always ask me what they should look for. First is restricted or monitored communications. Second, locks and fences that confine occupants. Third is isolation, someone who has their movement restricted or controlled. Monitored or controlled communication can also be an indication. Withholding documents or pay is very frequently an indication. Degrading working conditions can be a bad labor situation, but it can also be human trafficking. Inhumane living or working conditions is the same. Instilling a fear of authorities, as we talked about, is often an addition. Verbal abuse, and then again, of course, the totality of circumstances. I'm going to close by telling you what I think we should all worry about, right? So everyone here is wearing clothing, and I'm grateful for that. But how many of you know where your clothes come from, right? How many of you know where your t-shirts have been made or who made your t-shirt? I love Apple products. I have an iPhone. Everybody probably followed the story recently about forced labor conditions in China at the Apple factories. There is no question in my mind that we all, at some point in time, have probably worn a t-shirt that was the product of some form of forced labor, or that we all, at some point in time, have eaten a tomato that was harvested by migrant workers in Florida who live in appalling conditions and are often victims of forced labor. And so I think that there's a disconnect in the world that we live in between what human trafficking is, and I've given you a lot of numbers and a lot of facts, and how it impacts us every day. And trust me, 2 things I'll tell you. One is that it's here in New York. There are a huge number of cases in New York, some reported, some unreported. And 2, we're all unwilling participants in it. And so I always say to people that you have to worry about t-shirts and tomatoes, and what we have to do is figure out a better way to realize when we are complicit, unintentionally, of course, in what's happening worldwide with human trafficking. And if you want to know what your slavery footprint is, there's actually a great website now at the State Department, which I've done with my law students in my trafficking class at NYU, that you can go on and you can actually say, I own 3 blazers and 4 pairs of jeans, and I wear makeup every day, or I wear makeup 3 times a week, and it will tell you based on a statistical model that was created, I don't remember if it was Stanford or Berkeley, it will tell you your slavery footprint. And I can tell you that it's, I don't remember what my number was, but the deputy head of the trafficking persons office, her number was like 32, right? So the idea was that she had 32 people who had actually been involved in slavery on her behalf. So I would encourage all of you to check that out. Peggy, press it way down.
I want to begin first by thanking you, Michelle, for the invitation to be here and for the organization of this conference, which not only this panel, but which I see has been a really comprehensive look at this issue globally. Thank you so much. I'm also very happy, of course, to share the panel with my friend now, Anne Milgram, and who is not only a remarkable force of nature in this field, really, without question, but also a true human being. And I think I'm also very happy to be here with each of you in this room, because just by the fact that you're here and you're interested, and this is a topic that you are interested in, that indicates to me that I am among people who I share a common passion with, a common vision with, and that's always touching and inspiring to me. I also want to say a word of gratitude for being able to be a part of actually the work that Covenant House does. As Michelle told you, just in the last 3 years, I've come to work at Covenant House, and my work, I have the privilege of supporting, in whatever way we can, from New York, the work that's done in 4 of our sites in Latin America. And I have to say that because I don't do the work, and I'm not on the front lines, that I am deeply touched, and have been deeply touched by the work that is done there. And so I feel a great gratitude. I'm also grateful that all of you have clothes on, although they told us that if you really don't want to be nervous in front of a group, you should imagine them all without clothes on, and then you won't be scared to be up here. But this isn't too scary a group. I also want to say that in my footprint, I really don't wear makeup 3 times a week, or even 2. I did put it on for today, but my footprint probably is really bad in other ways. And thirdly, I'm going to put out a set of PowerPoint slides. It's not for the print part of it. There's some pictures and some images. The reason is that I work, and the most impressive thing I'm going to do today is I'm going to put this up here now, okay? Just want to show you this now. Okay, wait, no, not yet. Ta-da! Okay? No, you have no idea how impressive that is. That took me about 20 minutes before you all got here. Okay, now I don't know if I'm supposed to look at this or this. I'm so confused. But anyway, you think I should look here? Then I don't get to look at you, so I'm going to just wing it. All right, so first, before I begin, as I told you, I work in Covenant House, and we have programs in 4 countries of Latin America. But first I want to place us, much like Anne did, in the reality at this point in Central America and in Mexico. And it is not a pretty one or an easy one. First of all, the whole context of violence in Central America and in Mexico, it's just absolutely, it's become one of the most violent places in the world. I lived in Central America in the 70s and the 80s, and it was, at that time, one of the most violent places in the world, but largely because of nationalistic uprisings and wars against repressive governments. And now we have an entirely different situation in that country. And we won't go through all of these, but I just want to give you an idea comparatively in the world where Latin America stands. Honduras has now become has the highest rate of homicide in the world. I don't know anybody who 5 years ago would have said that Honduras would be the first in the world in terms of homicide. As some of these statistics here tell you, the rate of youth violence in Latin America is twice that of Africa and 300 times that of the developed world. One of the things that I think gives us a sense of this, the World Bank published a report in which they talked about Spain having the same population as Central America. But in 2006, Spain had about 300 and something murders. And Central America had 14,000 murders, okay? And that was 2006. We're now in 2012. And so logarithmically, you've seen the violence increase. The reality is that much of this violence is centered on youth, sadly enough, and much of the violence is centered on women and girls within the statistics here. And each one of these, just in Honduras, just in this last week and a half, 3 either residents or former residents of Casa Alianza Honduras have been found murdered and thrown in the street. 1 young woman and 2 boys. This is not something that's foreign to anyone in these countries. In Guatemala, I think the figure is something here like 45 young people a month are killed in the streets. In Mexico, it's 8 a day. Each of them has a name. Each of them has a face. Each of them has a history and a family. And these are all the statistics, take on, have a real life and a real story behind them. And this is the reality that not only our young people come from, but that our staffs work within. In Guatemala, it's dangerous to get on a bus and go to your workplace because you don't know if you're going to be robbed or you're going to be shot or the bus is going to be grenaded. That's the kind of violence that's now a part of the fabric of life. In Guatemala, Honduras, and in El Salvador, now called the Northern Triangle, there is an unbelievable amount of gang violence. As you realize, many young people came to this country, right? During the 80s, they went to California, to other places. They became part of the very big gangs there, the 18, the 13, the whole group of gangs. Then those gang members came back to Central America, so we began exporting gang members from here. And gang violence not only has become more prevalent, and it really controls certain barrios and so on, but it's also become far more organized. And the next, just talk for a moment about organized crime, because this issue of drugs, we all understand, as Anne pointed out so aptly, that the drug issue has become enormously important in our world, and we've paid a lot of attention to it and time and funding for it. But the reality is that human trafficking is following right behind it at a rate that's really, really terrible. And the fact that gang violence and organized crime is now becoming much more involved in human trafficking. And in the region itself, human trafficking in persons, these are just some, again, the numbers, exactly as you said, Anne, I totally agree that it's so difficult to know the numbers. One of our goals, we have these programs in 4 countries. Our goal over the next 2 years is to do some much better statistical gathering now on this issue, because really there is very, very poor evidence. On the other hand, if you just look at the reality, and if we just look at the young people that we serve, we know that the numbers that we're hearing have some substance to them. These are not being manufactured. So in this case, basically the State Department report says exactly the same thing, that international traffickers or international drug dealers are moving to trafficking in Mexico, that now there's many boy trafficking victims, not just girl trafficking victims, not only in Guatemala, but in every country that we're in, and that, parents sometimes sell their children into trafficking. The fact of the matter is that the traffickers that we've seen in Central America, they can be parents themselves, they can be regular citizens, they can be church members, they can be teachers, or they can be members of really, really dangerous organized crime groups that make any work in trafficking, public work in trafficking, a really, really risky business. And that's basically what everyone that lives in Central America now is facing. So I just want to say a little bit about Covenant House in Latin America. Before I do, for those of you who don't know, Covenant House is basically, it's probably the largest human rights movement for homeless children in the Americas. And here in the United States, in 15 different cities, we have programs. All of our programs include residential shelters, 24-hour shelters, but our goal is never just to provide housing and shelter. It's to really give every single child who comes to us the truest sense of who they are, or reflect that to them, and at the same time provide them with the kind of services that can make a new life possible. So we have shelters in 15 cities here, and in 2 places, in Toronto and Vancouver in Canada, and then of course in our 4 countries in Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Honduras. Our history began in 1981, so we're in Central America over 30 years. It began in Guatemala with many of the children who were victims of the war and repression for years, decades actually, that went on in Guatemala. And so we operated there until actually 2008. That's the wrong figure there, but we had to close for lack of funding. As many of you that come from non-governmental organizations, you understand the difficulties with funding. We were then able to get a grant from the State Department in the office that Anne spoke about to open what we have now, which is a shelter for trafficked girls, and now trafficked teens and their babies as well. So Guatemala was our first place, then Honduras and Mexico and Nicaragua. We're located in capital cities, but like Anne said, many trafficking victims, they don't have to be moved. Many are, and they're either running within a country or they're running between countries. So we serve children from all over countries, and we also serve from other countries. Open door policy basically means that our door is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. That's unusual in Central America. That's a service that's really, really not readily available. So it's something that's needed and that actually provides a service where there's a hole in services. And the methodology we'll talk a little bit about. Just so you get an idea, you see some of the images now of these young people. Those young people in the first picture, those are boys. You see how young they are. We're 12 to 18, but often our kids are younger than that, depending on how they've come in and what they need. All of those boys at the top are in our Center for Addicted Young Boys. If you can imagine that all of them are addicts and they need to have that addressed. The second, and we take care of about 165 to 180 kids a night in Honduras. That's our biggest program. In Mexico, you'll see that we have youth between 12 and 18. These are some of the older people that we've met on street outreach. They take care of about 100 to 125 children a night. Up there we have some in Nicaragua, some of our moms and babies. And sadly enough, we have a number of moms in Nicaragua who have also been trafficking victims at the same time. And they take care of 80 to 100 in La Alianza, which, we were given funding to start with 10 girls last December and 20 girls this December. Supposedly, we now have 50 girls that have been sent to us largely by the authorities and 13 babies are there. So there's a need that's just absolutely stultifying in this region. So very quickly, I'm just going to go through, and this is, as I said before, it's really important to us to provide a comprehensive, a multidisciplinary team and a comprehensive approach. So in all of our residences in Latin America, there's a process by which we have, first of all, street outreach. Our teams every day are out in the cities, not just the capitals, but other places, really reaching out to street people. Sometimes our street outreach, they're amazing teams. They're the only people that know the names and stories of these kids on the street. Many of them never come into the residence. They never become unhomeless. They stay there, but our staff provides whatever kind of support is possible there. If they do decide to come and seek our services, we have a pre-community where they can get to know the services that are offered. And then, of course, if they come to live in the residence, we have a program in which our first goal is in our first level is to just provide stability for our kids. The second goal is to make sure that they're able to participate in usual kids' activities, school, sports, and so on. And the third is to help them to either go back to their family if it's safe, or to move on to some kind of independent life in the future. And to do that, we have a multidisciplinary staff of frontline people 24 hours a day, obviously. And we provide all of these services at the bottom that are important. Any child who's trafficked, any child who's suffered what these young people have suffered has multiple needs, multiple issues. And so we need to look at those and address those. So I'll just take a little bit more in Honduras. We do have a house that's very specifically for trafficked girls as well, and for sexually exploited girls, in our house for boys. But the program in Honduras that I think is really, really important, that just started in 2010, has to do with migrant children. We spoke a little bit about how the numbers of children, the highest numbers of children coming into the United States, they're all running, as we speak right now, through Central America on their way. 3,000, UNICEF, and this is a really, really, I'm not sure, it's a modest number, but UNICEF says that 3,000 young people under the age of 18, so minors, leave Honduras unaccompanied every year for the United States. So just think about this. Think about your children. Think about your brothers and sisters. Think about people you know that are 18 years of age, that are under 18 years of age. And imagine them setting out by themselves, with no adult with them, to cross two different countries as illegals in all of those countries, and to enter a third country which clearly is not waiting for them with open arms. You can only imagine, how it makes them much more vulnerable to traffickers, to coyotes, to people who are moving them, to any other kind of issues. So it's a place where we decided in Honduras particularly, we found out, this is what we found out. Now just think about this. Every week in Mexico, so the kids move through Guatemala, they get to Mexico, they're picked up in Mexico. Mexico puts them in a child detention center in Tapachula, Mexico, which is by the border in Guatemala. They're then placed on a bus every week. About 25 to 30 of those kids are put on a bus and sent back to Honduras. Before we went up to the border, what would happen is that they would get to the border, very isolated, about 6 hours outside of the next major city. And the Ministry of the Family, they'd be removed from the bus from Mexico and put on the Ministry of the Family, and then they'd be moved into San Pedro Sula. When they got there, the children were released to adults. Nobody knew if they were their parents, if they were their brothers, their sisters, their pimp, their trafficker. No idea who those children. Imagine they had left, and now nobody was kind of watching as they came back. So we decided to go up, and in the last, since January of 2010, we've met about 1,000 children at that border. Every bus load that goes, we go with the Ministry of Health. We've been able to interview them. We've been able to offer services. We've had about 60 of them come and live in our shelter with us because they had no other alternative. We've placed a number back with their families. But it's an area of connection, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, of migrancy with trafficking. It's really, really important. They're really, really connected. And in Mexico, we also have shelters for our boys and girls. We have a particularly strong independent life program in Mexico, because as you know very well, you can only imagine, if you're a trafficked adult or child, particularly if you're a child or a young person, you need to have some kind of economic stability, or that trafficker is going to be totally able to get you back, right, into doing what you had to do. So economic stability is very important. So a lot of our work has to do with teaching kids what they need to do. And in Mexico, we have relationships with many, many different companies. When I was in Embassy Suites there, they also have a relationship with Embassy Suites. And in all of these places, kids get a chance to have like a year internship and on-the-job training. And that particular month, one of the kids from Covenant House was the Employee of the Year, of the month, excuse me. And everybody knew Pablo. You know, when I said, I was there for Casa Alianza, ay, Pablo es impresionante, es un hombre que realmente nos ayuda. And it was so exciting for me to realize this child's life was changing as I was watching it because of this kind of relationship that's been established over many, many years. And of course, they run the only 24-hour hotline, which of course serves, especially in these countries. Mexico is the only country that I know of that actually has one of those. And in Nicaragua, we have we call it the Hilton Home, not because it looks like the Hilton Hotel. It's kind of odd when they say we're going over to the Hilton, El Hilton, you say in Spanish, but it's because Casa Alianza won the Hilton Humanitarian Award many years ago and was able to build that house. That residence. Because of that, they also have a home for teen moms and babies. And we're doing a new work in Nicaragua because we're going to barrios where there's really, really bad conditions, pimps, prostitution, drugs, and so on. And we're really working within those barrios to try to prevent kids from becoming homeless and trafficked. And that's actually been really exciting and effective. And in Guatemala, as I told you, we now have 50 girls. We've also reached out and done a tremendous amount of training there, especially of police in Guatemala. It's hard to believe this, and Anne knows this because you've done training in Haiti and in many other places. In these countries, we're training the police about what the law is on trafficking in Guatemala, what the law is and what you do when you find a trafficking case. Because really, there's not either the resource or sometimes the will, depending, to do that. So that you end up playing a role that's really quite unusual in that way. And I'm just going to very quickly talk about essential. Like I said before, when you talk about trafficking victims, you know, these kids that come in have been the object of violence you can hardly even take in. One of the last young people that we just received in Honduras was a twin. He was found hanging from a tree by his neck. His twin was dead next to him, hung, and he had watched his entire family be slaughtered in front of him in order to try to get information. He's 11 years old. And so the trauma, you can imagine, the multiple levels of trauma that these people suffer psychologically, as well as physical damage, as well as emotional, financial, there's just no end to it. So you have to approach the assistance for them at multiple levels. Some of them I've mentioned already, so I'll run through. But one I really, really want to talk about is obviously the psychological and emotional level. You know, I have the words up here, love, respect, and belief in capitals, because I'll tell you, we can't, every child that comes to Covenant House or anywhere in the world really, unless they choose, they have to make a choice for themselves. They have to make a choice for their lives. But everything about trafficking has tried to take that choice away from them. Huh? And so how do you provide an environment in which a child can see who they are, truly who they are, beyond every bit of damage that has happened to them? And so that environment has to be incredibly respectful, incredibly looking for the participation of that child in their own life, and incredibly able to see the potential and the talent of that child, because they can't see it often. So I put those in big letters because I think that's probably the most important thing one can do along with the other services as a basis. But I do want to mention the psychological intervention as well, and I really want to say something to you, Michelle, and thank you for the work that Michelle did. For example, we are really looking always for the most effective psychological means that we can use to cut through multi-trauma issues. And just recently, in the past year, Dr. Gallietta was instrumental in helping us to train our psychologists, 4 of our psychologists from our countries there, in a DBT method, which is dialectical behavioral therapy here at John Jay. She's a tremendous expert in this. But you can see that kind of cooperation, how it's affected our programs, because we have to find the most effective ways to be able to deal with this kind of trauma. We also use, obviously, psychiatric services, addiction services, all the traditional kinds of things. But we also realize we have to use everything possible: art, music, dance, theater. You see up there, therapy assisted by horses. At first I thought they were horseback riding, and that was what it was. Seriously, I wasn't sure. But what it is in Mexico, with great effectiveness, they were using sessions, they've had repetitive sessions with horses in a corral, and the interaction of the young people, and they used it specifically with sexually exploited and trafficked children. The interaction of the children with the animals, and with, of course, special assistance and training in that, has really done a tremendous amount to be able to help them, particularly to express what's happened to them. You know, children don't come to you and say, I was trafficked and that's why I'm here. No child comes in and says, I was trafficked. First of all, most children don't come in and tell you much at all because they don't trust you yet and they don't know you. So you have to establish trust with them. You have to hear what that story is, and only when you understand the story do you have any idea, even if not only are legally trafficked, but what they're actually facing. And so the reality is that for trafficked kids, it takes a long time to establish the kind of trust and relationship that's necessary. And I already talked about this, formal education, job skills, and so on. We don't just train kids with vocational skills, but you know, we have to train them for success. You can train a child in a vocational skill, but they also have to understand that it's important to arrive on time and how to dress and how to relate with staff and so on. Those are life skills that are really key to success. Legal assistance, very obviously, I'm not going to go through all of this, but these kids come in with enormous legal needs. Sometimes they've been charged with criminal things themselves. They often don't have identity papers. One of the most important things we can do, though, is when they themselves need to be witnesses in trials against traffickers. Sometimes they're high-profile cases, sometimes they're not, but they have to face their trafficker often in court. Although in Guatemala they've developed hearings now with the camera. What is the name of that camera? There's a name, anyway. There's a name to that camera where a child can now testify off without having to face. But this requires tremendous preparation. And we also don't just work with our own staff, we work with prosecutors and with judges in training to really help them to understand the importance of how to treat a child during these kinds of hearings, because re-traumatization is most common. I already spoke a little bit about migrant kids and the thousands that are running. I'm not going to spend any more time on it, except to say that if you're going to be dealing with trafficked children and what their needs are, then you need to be able to deal with consulates, with all the legal issues that go with that. And the last thing is really advocacy. You know, you can take care of just so many children in a facility, But we all need to be advocates for changes in policy and practice, laws, and not just laws, but enforcement of laws and so on. So we play, as non-governmental organizations or even as members of government, we play a huge role in making sure that policy and practice really does work to support kids that are trafficked. So I guess the last thing is that it implies risk. As I said this before, anybody that's working in this area, and many of you in your work, I'm sure, for justice in the same way, it implies a tremendous amount of risk. Our national director in Honduras was under house police surveillance for about, not surveillance, police protection for almost a year after threats on his life. We've had threats on the life of our Guatemala director. This is a reality that's really dangerous and requires a tremendous amount of risk and commitment. The last thing I just want to finish with, this is a mural that's on our wall in Nicaragua. And the first left side of the wall, as soon as you walk into Nicaragua, you will remember this, Anne, probably, is you see on the left side the tremendous darkness. You know, these are the kids you can see. They're sick, they're being hurt, they're being hit. And as the mural moves to the right-hand side, you see, you know, kids with playing music in school and so on, in the kind of paradigmatic ways that we think about children having happiness. I just want to finish, I guess, by saying to all of you that this is not just obviously the work of Covenant House. This is the work that Anne does. This is the work that Michelle has dedicated her life to. And this, I believe, is the work that so many of you have done and continue to do. It requires risk from you and dedication, and probably one of the most lovely things about being a part of any one of these conferences is being in the same room with and even having the chance to meet people like you that are doing this. So I just want to tell you it's a joy and a privilege to be in your company. Thank you.
We have a few moments for questions, if anyone has comments or questions. Yes?
Yeah, this question is for Ms.
Can you stand up, please?
Would you mind standing up? They just asked. I'm sorry.
So I actually deal with organized crime in East Asia. And so some of the activities are, of course, human trafficking. And some of the methods you talked about threatening them, some subtle, some not so subtle, include suggesting that they're breaking the law here in the U.S. They came here illegally, fake visa or through Canada, that they would be subject to U.S. law, or at best deported, with which they would be threatened with shame, not being able to marry, or going so far as to also threaten their families. So I'm wondering what sorts of protections are there for the victims, kind of realistic protections that address these very real problems?
So that's a great question. Did everyone hear the question? No. Okay, so the question is really, in this instance we're talking about Asia, but the question is victims who are threatened, mostly threats of legal process. What protections exist in the United States, right, for victims? This is an interesting, and it's a great question because the Trafficking Victims Protection Act really has three parts. The first part is the criminal prosecution part, which criminalizes forced labor and sex trafficking. The second part is how to treat victims, and really talks about rights of victims and how victims should be treated in trafficking prosecutions. And the third part really deals a lot with the State Department and the fact that, as you probably know, each year the United States Department of State essentially rates the entire world, every country in the world, in terms of human trafficking. That's a longer, more complicated sort of thing to explain, but basically those are the three parts of the statute. When it comes to victims, what I have found, and I say this very candidly, is that whenever I've done a case or worked with victims from other countries, we have been remarkably successful in assisting victims, in moving victims, in helping victims get access to benefits and basic opportunities to start a new life. There are visas, there are things called continued presence that allow victims to stay in the U.S. while a case might be pending. There are T visas and U visas that victims can apply for on their own or with law enforcement. And so there are mechanisms. And one reason why I think we've been far more successful with international victims than we have with domestic victims is that we look at international victims essentially and we treat them the same as we treat refugees, because they're generally people from other countries. They don't have family, they don't have support networks, they often don't have authorization to work here legally, and they don't even have funding. And so what the Department of Human Services does and what some of the other grants do is basically provide for additional assistance for victims who are foreign. It is far more difficult with domestic victims because those resources do not exist. So you don't have the ability to move people. You don't have the ability to help people necessarily start in a new community. And this is a conversation that happens every single time the law gets reauthorized. Why do we treat international victims one way and victims who are domestic differently? The only other thing I'd say is that there are a huge number of nonprofits and NGOs that do a lot of work with victims, and I would never have been able to do my cases without them. So the ability to help a victim, the government is not, what the government does is fund some of those NGOs and those nonprofits, but the true heroes work is done by the people in those organizations.
Questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned working with police and prosecutors, judges, getting to train them and orient them to working with these populations. Can you say a bit more about how they perceive them?
And Annie should comment as well on yours. It's so interesting in the countries themselves. In Guatemala, we just received the Hands of Peace Award from the Presidential Office for training 1,500 police there. But that's also because right now in Guatemala, right, there happens to be someone who's in charge of the Human Rights Office in the police department who's an old human rights activist and who allowed this to happen. It really depends often on who you have within each of those organizations. But I do have to say that within each of the countries that we're in, we've actually been received. Now, it's taken many years to get a relationship that works. But it's to the government's advantage as well that they be trained, I think, well. And I think that's what, to some extent, motivates sometimes the training. Judges, sometimes their motivation is harder, although there are ways to motivate them as well. And prosecutors, because they're presenting cases, we often find that we're collaborating with them. Our legal staff is in those cases, and we've come to develop a relationship that's really quite mutual and respectful, because often it's our victim that is providing the testimony or the evidence for them and so on. So there's been a tremendously positive back and forth, not all cases, but at least in general.
So, I would add to what Peggy said. I mean, the first thing is just the real acknowledgement of how much corruption exists in some of the countries that we're talking about working in. And I think, we have to be really honest with what we find in other countries in order to try to figure out how we can best help. And I'll tell you the story in a second, but that is a part of what we find. And sometimes that does impact how effective you can be with police and prosecutors. But what I have found is, particularly I'm working in Haiti right now, but I've worked in other countries, and what I have generally found is that a lot of people are very receptive to learning about trafficking cases and what the U.S. has done. We're not perfect. We are only 10 years, 11 years in, but we're also in many cases 10 or 11 years ahead of other countries. And so, and candidly, I have the same conversations with law enforcement here when I do U.S.-based trainings, and I talk to the police and prosecutors, and people will say, but there's a photograph of the victim at a birthday party having a great time. Does that mean that somebody's not a victim of human trafficking? So they're the same questions about where the line gets drawn, what kind of conduct is criminal, and also just investigatively, how do you make a case, right? And these are often very difficult cases to make. You'll often have, you've got victims who have criminal records, maybe because they were forced into prostitution. You may think about the domestic servitude for 19 years. A woman who really wasn't seen by other folks. And so the only witnesses, the witnesses at trial were the entire family who said, of course this was voluntary, versus one woman who'd been, and there's corroborating evidence you have to get, but we spend a lot of time talking about how do you actually build a case from the ground up, and we get a lot of receptivity. I will tell you very briefly, I think it's changed enormously. In 2002, 2003, I went to Mexico a number of times on sex trafficking cases. The first time I got there, in one of my cases, the person who was in charge, the prosecutor who was in charge of official corruption, political corruption, was my liaison through the embassy. And we wanted to go out to this town, Tenancingo, which many of you may know. It is really just ground zero in Mexico for sex trafficking of juveniles. And women, and so we wanted to get to Tenancingo. We knew there were additional victims. We wanted to interview them. The first day, I was told that there were no SUVs that were available because I needed a bulletproof SUV. And meanwhile, I was with ICE agents. I didn't think I needed a bulletproof SUV. But about midday, I went downstairs, and we were in the basement, and it was filled with bulletproof SUVs. Right? 2 days later, we were told, well, the weather's really bad. Now, meanwhile, Tenancingo is, 2 hours outside of Mexico City, and the weather was spectacularly beautiful. And I spent a week there and didn't get access to anywhere near going to Tenancingo. And I came back and was incredibly frustrated, and there's no question of the way that the politics works in some of these countries. The traffickers are very powerful people in many instances. It's often organized crime. This was a family that had a lot of financial assets in this town, and clearly was ingratiated with local politicians and government. And so I came back and I spent a lot of time with the State Department Office of Trafficking, and I don't think they get enough credit sometimes for the work that they do, because what they ultimately did is they put Mexico on the watch list for human trafficking based on my experience in Mexico. That report came out on a Monday. On Tuesday, the same guy called me and said, would you like to come back? I went down the following week. I interviewed a number of victims. I got a lot of evidence and information. And Mexico, the first plane where they brought people, remember Mexico didn't used to extradite people to the US. About 5 years ago, they started extraditing people again. And on the first plane were 2 of our traffickers. So I've seen an enormous change over the past decade, but I still think in a lot of countries, we have a long way to go. And it's going to take a lot of time and energy to get there.
And just the last comment on this, just the same in Mexico. Right now, we're in a case, we have a case of a child that we know that where the evidence has disappeared. This happens all the time. As in Honduras, Honduras is like a failed state almost at this point. The Ministry of Health has been intervened, what they call there, which basically means it's not functioning, and it's being investigated. The police actually were also being intervened and investigated because of a huge cell they found within the police that was actually like the ones in Mexico now, the Zetas and so on, doing hit squads. It turns out, just so that you get an idea, it turns out, remember I said that our national director was under police protection, 24-hour police protection? It turns out that the people, in his precinct, police precinct, was the cell where they had all the hitmen and the mafia people. So the people that were guarding his house every day, were the same cell of people who were all involved in the trafficking and so on and so forth. This is the reality. It's incredibly complex. You have to be incredibly sophisticated, but you also have to be willing to kind of let go of all sorts of, how do I want to say it, ideas that you have about who you should and who you shouldn't work with, and then try to just do the best you can with the people that are out there.
And can I give one more example, because I think that this is a really important point. In Haiti, I spent time with the police officer who's in charge of child protection, who's a great guy, and basically has, I can't remember if he has 12 or 20 officers in the entire country to do work on child protection. And so in some instances, we face hurdles of corruption or people who don't understand the legal issues. In Haiti, it's a question of pure capacity. There are no child protection officers in certain parts of the country. There are routine reports of child sexual assault, right? And that's the number one complaint that they get, the people who are in charge of child welfare. It's the number one complaint they get. There are no officers. To get an officer to investigate, they have to get them on a bus. They often have no funding to get the officer on a bus. They have no weapons. They don't have cars. And so can you imagine, you're sending an officer out on a sex crimes case, right? And so we all think about whatever city we live in or whatever police groups we've worked with. You think, the officer's going to go knock on someone's door and start to interview them. That's not the case. In Haiti, in many instances, you would talk about a 5-hour bus trip that an officer didn't have bus fare for, where he would have to get there and then try to convince a trafficker to come back with him. Right? When you start to think about it, it broke my heart because I really thought this guy was fantastic and trying to do a great job, and there's just an unbelievable capacity question in some of these countries.
Thank you all so much for attending. We have a break outside.